Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to move out west and talk about how the growing industrialization and the profound transformation of American society in the Gilded Age helped affect and change the landscape of the western part of the United States. This incredibly short lived era of the quote unquote Wild West often seems like sort of a throwback to the earlier Jeffersonian or Manifest Destiny eras of sort of unlimited potential and individualism, conquering sort of the unconquered quote unquote lands of the West. But in reality, it was completely interconnected with the rest of the industrialization that was happening at the time, both in causes and effects. So let's dive in and talk about the Wild West. Here are your basic objectives for today. Take a moment, pause, take them in, and we'll move forward. So the Wild West, like much of the rest of this era, was financed and made possible by railroad construction. Railroads made all of the economic activity and all of the settlement that happened in the West possible. The Pacific Railway Act, as we talked about before, paved the way for the transcontinental railroad that we talked about as part of the big Great Race. But we also saw railroads crisscrossing the southern, middle, and northern parts of the country as the country became more interconnected together, as other railroad companies sought to capitalize on the natural resources of these areas and make tremendous amounts of money. And so all of these railroads helped build and spur economic development in the West. One of the main effects of all of these railroads is we saw a series of repeated gold and silver rushes. We're of course familiar with the 1848 gold rush out in California that helped lead to the settlement of the West Coast and push the Compromise of 1850. But there were also massive gold and silver rushes in a lot of other places. The whole pattern of the gold rush of 48 is going to be repeated in a bunch of different places. Basically, someone is going to discover large veins of precious metals. People are going to rush in order to try to make as much money off of it as possible. And then in the end, the resources will be exhausted and these societies, these settlements, things like that will collapse. For the most part, all of these towns were not very particularly long lasting, but it should also be noted that without the railroads, there was really no way to get this gold and silver effectively out of the West. And so the growth of technology and of infrastructure helped facilitate these gold and silver rushes. And the money that was created from these gold and silver rushes helped spur increasing railroad building and increased industrialization. So these gold and silver rushes, although they feel, again, like isolated phenomena, are completely connected to the rest of the industrialization that was happening in the United States during this time. Most of these gold and silver rushes led to spectacular speculative bubbles. Although the story that we often imagine about gold and silver rushes is that one individual comes out, finds gold, a bunch of individuals rush in an attempt to get rich off of these gold and silver deposits. And honestly, for the most part, it was silver deposits. There were some gold deposits out in the West, but silver is much more common sort of throughout the Rocky Mountain region. But what would generally happen is people would dash in, claim land, and then sell them to a variety of different speculative companies who were hoping that they would buy up the land that had the richest deposits on it and then make massive amounts of money. This led to huge speculative bubbles in the West and a variety of different crashes once both these deposits of gold and silver were exhausted, but also as more and more people bought up this land and they realized that the land that they had bought was worthless. And then they either tried to sell it off at a loss or concocted some lie about gold and silver being there in order to try to make a profit. You also saw huge amounts of opportunists coming out in order to provide sort of the needed supplies for miners. Your food suppliers, housing sort of hotel suppliers, saloons, brothels, things like that. A bunch of social services that they felt like miners would benefit from. And if you want to look at who really made it rich out of these gold and silver deposits, some of it was of course companies that were mining the gold and silver, but a lot of it was the people who were providing services to miners, because the miners would often take all their wages and then go spend it on sort of creature comforts in order to, improve the quality of their somewhat unpleasant mining lives. The Comstock Lode was one of the most famous of these, and it led to the growth of Virginia City and in Nevada. And we saw this pattern happen time after time again. Massive amounts of wealth came in, and then eventually it was exhausted and the town vanished and disappeared. This also opened the door for significant amounts of theft and the sort of Wild West bandits that we're famous for, that have become famous in American popular culture. William Bonney, of course, made his sort of fame as a bank robber. Sam Bass robbed trains that were bringing a lot of this wealth back across the United States. Obviously, trains packed with silver provide a very convenient target for a lot of these outlaws. And then, of course, in conjunction with this, you had other people like, Doc Holliday and some of these, and Wyatt Earp, and some of these lawmen who would then try to bring these bandits to justice through legal and extra legal means. Your whole famous shootout at the OK Corral is a thing that absolutely happened. And so we see this rise in banditry in the West, which on the one hand is somewhat of a problem because, theft and murder. But on the other hand, we get this sort of idealized version of these outlaws, and they form this sort of mythologized place in society. And so take a moment and pause. This is about the Sundance Kid and Butch Cassidy and their attacks on the Union Pacific Railroad. So take a moment, pause, take it in. And so we see outlaws sitting for pictures. We see the famous female bandit Pearl Hart becoming a fashion icon, in addition to her, robbing of banks and attempted train robberies. We see people like Jesse James, who sort of bring the whole Civil War into it, both attacking what he saw as institutions of federal authority that were responsible for the South losing the war, as well as, stealing stuff and murdering people. And in the end, these outlaws take this sort of outsized place in American history, despite the fact that this was only an era that lasted for a few years. They become seen to some as heroes, pushing back against the massive change we're seeing in the United States at this time, and sort of fighting for for the common man and for a simpler lifestyle. At a time in which massive corporations owned by Carnegie and Rockefeller were not dominating American life. And so they fit in a very strange place in American society. This also led to new political movements. We talked about currency reform issues and things like that. With all this new money flowing in, we were having some problems with liquidity. And so there was this push to continue to coin money in order to increase the money supply and specifically help out farmers in debt. Farmers had gone into massive amounts of debt in order to both buy more land, to be competitive, and buy new sort of technological innovations, which were also necessary to be competitive, because as more land went under cultivation, grain prices were falling. And so they felt like the coining of more money would lead to inflation and lead to rising grain prices and make it easier for farmers to pay off their debt. The problem, of course, with this is it would then hurt workers. And so this battle over currency reform is going to be one of the central battles between rural and urban areas that we're going to see sort of arching over the politics of the Gilded Age. Here's the Greenback Party, which was founded in the 1870s, and these movements would eventually morph into the larger political movement known as populism. So keep that in mind for when we get to the populists. Take a moment and read the advantages that the Greenback Party thinks they were going to get from inflation. And keep in mind that there's not a huge movement towards this, but the Harrison administration does push the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which increases the money supply slightly in order to, again, provide some relief. So the Sherman Silver Purchase Act allowed the government to purchase more silver. This is partially to benefit silver miners, of course, which would push up the price of silver and benefit these large corporations, but also somewhat to provide inflation relief for farmers who are struggling. But the people who are hurt by this, of course, are workers whose low wages can't keep pace with inflation. And so again, you're helping one group of people at the expense of another. This is one of the real problems with economic policy, is it's very difficult to craft a specific economic policy that targets and benefits one group without causing substantial problems to other parts of the economy. And one of the reasons why economic policy is so complicated and difficult to get past and to get people behind. Out west, we're seeing a substantial settlement of the plains, and this is going to cause substantial problems that we're, of course, going to talk about tomorrow. But we hopefully remember all the various things that sort of led to the settlement of the plains. We remember the center draft plow, which allows us to more easily churn up prairie topsoil. We remember the Homestead Act, which allows people to get free land in the West. And so all of that is going to lead to increasing settlement of the plains, leading to some pretty substantial hardships. So as people move out west, they often sort of mythologize what farming is going to be like. And so I'll give you a moment to read this. Generally, farming in the West was extremely difficult, but at the same time, we are seeing more acreage put under cultivation. Addendums to the Homestead Act, like the Timber Culture Act, which encourages people to plant trees in order to stop erosion and to sort of provide for timber, allows people to get more acres of land. The Timber and Stone Law allowed people to substantially increase their holdings again. And so we start seeing farmers getting larger and larger plots of land to farm. And they're able to do this because of new technological innovations, which allow one individual or a couple individuals to do more farm work with less labor. This is, of course, an additional factor as far as people moving to cities, because the opportunities for being a farm laborer are starting to dry up as the jobs that were originally done by farm laborers are being increasingly mechanized. But it also leads to more efficient creation and production of agricultural goods, and also the squeezing out of small farmers who now have difficulty competing, because as we increase the amount of agricultural products in the market, it leads to falling prices. And if you can't continue to cultivate more acres, your farm might not make it, and then it's time for you to move to the city and get a job there, which of course is a very different lifestyle and creates a whole series of other problems that we've talked about in some previous lessons. Here's the other cost of this, of course, is people being out on the prairie and struggling to adapt to the landscape. So take a moment and pause, and we'll take this in. The other thing that we saw growing greatly in this time period was ranching, specifically the growth of the cattle kingdom in Texas. Cows, as you remember, were not present in the Americas before the Columbian Exchange, but were introduced by Europeans and then began to grow and thrive, specifically longhorn free-range cattle throughout the areas of the southern United States, especially Texas. We were starting to see massive herds of these longhorn cattle roaming around Texas. And so a lot of individuals decided that individuals and corporations, I should say, decided that they could use these cows as a sort of a naturally occurring resource and make substantial money off of that. And so they would hire cowboys to go south and round up herds of these free-range cattle and then drive them northward to the sort of train area, to the train depots that were crossing the northern United States during this time period. These cattle drives to these cattle towns created the same type of boomtown effect that we saw during with the rushes out west of gold and silver. And so towns like Dodge City and Abilene, Pueblo, and places like that became destinations for these cattle drives as cowboys rounded up herds of cattle and then drove them into these cattle towns, which became hubs of economic activity with outlets mainly designed to service, cowboys. And so just like the mining towns, we saw a lot of saloons, hotels, things like that, brothels. And the famous saloon to church ratio was generally a pretty high number, which caused some substantial problems as you have, young men with lots of money, meeting other young men, leading to some significant conflict. So here's the governor of Kansas describing the problems that we saw in some of these cattle towns. So take a moment, pause, we'll move on. This era of the cowboy really only lasted for about a decade, much like the era of the Wild West. The open range ended for a variety of different reasons. Part of it was barbed wire. So the use of barbed wire allowed people to fence in cows much more easily. And so we started seeing more and more people sort of fencing off their territory and closing off the open prairies to these herds of wandering cowboys and cows. And the winter of 1886-87 was also devastating. So we had a drought throughout a lot of 1886, and then an incredibly cold, snowy winter in 86 to 87. This massive blizzard killed off a significant portion of the free-range cattle in Texas and basically stopped the cattle drives from happening anymore because you didn't have these huge herds of free-range cows. And so this mass death of cattle led to this smaller scale ranching and cattle husbandry. and also led to railroads being extended down into Texas in order to more directly load the cows onto trains. Because in the end, cows that had been driven across several states had to be fattened up again before they could be effectively sold, and would not be as profitable as cows that had simply been fattened up and then loaded onto a train car. And so this led to the end of the open range and really the end of the cowboy era. The effect of this is multifold. We started to see increased push of railroads into the West in order to access these cattle resources and to get these ranches, to get these cows to markets. We saw the growth of new technologies like refrigerated rail cars, which allowed people to butcher the cattle and then move them into cities. So you could kill them when they were much fatter and then preserve the meat. These additional calories and this additional food led to the massive expansion of American cities, as the plains provided tons of extra both grain and meat to help feed these growing urban populations. And so all of that led to substantial population growth and then also substantial economic and industrial growth. We saw the growth of towns like Kansas City and Chicago become sort of stockyard butchering towns that become famous for their variety of meat products, steak, sausage, things like that. And Americans' diets became more varied, and Americans started consuming more meat as meat became cheaper and more easily available. And so all of this led to the growth of the United States and this economic interconnectivity that really started to bring the modern era to the fore. And so that's what we have for today. For tomorrow, we'll start looking at some of the other effects of this. Obviously, there are groups of people that we might have forced onto this land and promised that it would be theirs forever. And they're going to be less than thrilled that we're again deciding that the land is useful. And so our next round of conflict with Native Americans and the last major round of conflict with Native Americans is going to come next week. But for now, thank you for listening.